Thanks, Jordan. Sorry for barging up, but I wasn't sure that I had my slot here. Now, thank you for coming. I was asked to present Privacy 101, which I took to mean, and confirmed with the organisers, a baseline discussion of what privacy law is and what regulation can do. What I've decided to do is do a brief history, talk about the current state and some of the emerging issues in privacy law locally and internationally. Now, I really hate PowerPoint, I have to say, but I misread the instruction from the organisers which says, please don't do a PowerPoint presentation, to say, I thought it said prepare a PowerPoint presentation. Anyway, so what I did instead was to create a Twitter stream. So if you want to see the slides that I've got, you can have a look on Twitter. The identity is Privacy 101 NetHui. I think I had to drop the I, it's just NetHui. It's a very basic introduction. I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence or experience, so please butt in with any questions or if you want to raise the tone. Where have we come from with privacy law in New Zealand? We start, I guess, in about 1974 with the Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act was what we passed in New Zealand to enact the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and very much later we extended that into a New Zealand Bill of Rights. But the Human Rights Act 1974 said it was our ratification, our enactment of those statements of human rights and anti-discrimination. That established the the Human Rights Commission, and gave them one of the functions of commenting on privacy, which they didn't do very much. In 1976, we had the Wanganui Computer Centre Act, which established a law enforcement computer. And of course, that caused great alarm because in this one facility, and we all know how scary computers were, there was going to be data processed from the Ministry of Transport, the police, the courts, all these different other agencies of the state, and potentially brought together. So that was subject to quite explicit regulation. We have a kind of tradition in New Zealand and in many Western democracies of passing laws which purport to, which in fact take away people's rights, and then they're called the Protection of What's Left Act. And in fact, that's largely what the Privacy Act does. We got our Privacy Act in 1991 when the government of the day wanted to introduce data matching between Inland Revenue, which, as some of you may know, is subject to very strict secrecy requirements, and other agencies, so they could pick up someone who was on a benefit, who was also having PAYE deducted, and make the electronic assumption that that person was double-dipping or defrauding the government, not that the Department of Social Welfare, as it was then, has forgotten to action some notification that's been given by a beneficiary. So the Privacy Commissioner Act was passed in 1991 specifically to allow that intrusion into privacy, to allow information matching. The Select Committee at the time, to its credit, and for all the criticism you might have of Peter Dunn, he's got to take credit for holding a line on this. The Select Committee said, all right, you'll have your information matching, we're going to set up a Privacy Commissioner to oversee it, and we want that Privacy Commissioner to work with the Select Committee to develop some more comprehensive rules about how we regulate privacy. Now that committee and the Commissioner looked around the world for some guidance, and they settled on data protection principles that had been put together by an OECD committee way back in 1980. So the OECD in 1980 decided that this new invention, this computer, represented such a threat to individual autonomy and loss of control of personal data that it needed to be regulated with these data protection principles. And as the speaker this morning said, New Zealand was first out of the box with a kind of comprehensive law which just grabbed those data protection principles and stuffed them into a domestic act. Just by way of anecdote, I think one of the first European countries to enact the OECD principles was Germany, and they have a data registration model, which means that any agency which processed personal information by means of a computer had to register with a data protection registrar. which meant that you and I, as members of the community, would get our transparency, preserve our autonomy, by going down to the Data Protection Registrar's office, looking up telecom and seeing what it did with our data. That was the kind of model. So New Zealand took quite a different and then radical approach to data protection laws. So at the core of our Privacy Act is those information privacy principles. There's a link there that'll take you through to the actual legislation, but here's a summary. There's 12 of them. The first 4, well, you're probably all familiar with these, so I'm not going to linger, but they basically cover the life cycle of an agency dealing with personal information. The first 4 are about the collection. You don't collect more than you need to carry out a legitimate function of your organisation. If you can, you get it from the source. This third one is really important. You've got to tell people why, and this is where privacy statements become very important. Now, some of you may have heard, I questioned our guest from the FTC this morning about the importance in the United States that the FTC places on privacy policies and the legalization which follows, meaning that we have these 7 or 10,000 word privacy policies that you're expected to have read when you sign up to a website like Google or Facebook. New Zealand says you've got to take reasonable steps to ensure people are aware of who's going to have the information and what they're going to use it for, and a bunch of other things. Security, Principle 5, is a really important one in our domestic context, and this is where ACC seems to have had their continuous pratfalls. They just have not got it right. One of the principles that the courts regard as most important is the right to see your own information. And the courts have been dishing out significant awards of damages. So that's Principle 6. That one has actually been in New Zealand law since 1982, in respect of government anyway. It used to live in the Official Information Act. A right to correct information. We see that one extended into a right to be forgotten, which is a topic I'm going to move to in a moment. But the right to correct being extended into, perhaps online, a right to have information deleted. Check information before you use it. Only use it for the purpose for which you've collected it. Don't give it out to anyone else. These are very general principles. And finally, something about unique identifiers that I needn't take up our valuable time with at the moment. So the Act, our Privacy Act, deals with personal information. All right, that's the key concept. And that is defined in the Act as information about an identifiable individual. Just think about that for a second. How expansive that is, how all-covering. There's no qualitative aspect in it. It doesn't say you've got to take certain steps with sensitive information. It doesn't say you've got to protect private information. It's information about an identifiable individual, whether it's publicly available somewhere or not. If you're an agency, which most of you are, you collect personal information, the obligations are imposed on you to protect that regardless of whether you would regard it as private or not private. And opinions vary considerably about what is sensitive or private. So we mustn't make too many assumptions about that. I don't know if you can see that, a question there, can an IP address be personal information? Well, yes, it can. That's a clever way of phrasing the question. If you were to ask me, is an IP address personal information, I'd have to say, it depends. I'm dealing with a case at the moment where somebody's alleging fraud through their computer. They're saying somebody else used the computer. Is the identity of the person who used their IP address information about them? I haven't quite got to the bottom of that one. Anyway, so we've got the concept of personal information. The people who have to comply with this law are agencies. That is an individual or a person. It's very broad. It excludes the news media in relation to their news gathering and dissemination activities. And it excludes the Governor-General and one or two others. One of the holes in the Privacy Act is that it doesn't regulate what you do in your personal household or family capacity. So there's all those bitchy or indiscreet Facebook postings or tweets about what you've been up to are not actually captured by this law unless, of course, you are doing that through an official agency account. If this is your own domestic use, this law is not, doesn't affect you. Okay? So that's a very brief once-over about what the Privacy Act does. Now, the Law Commission spent 4 years poring over this and other aspects of privacy law, and you can see their various recommendations on their website. I've got a link to it on this tweet. But they've recommended a bunch of tools for the Privacy Commissioner, which she went over this morning, so I won't repeat that either. I will mention this last tweet in the stream there. Of all the recommendations that the Law Commission has made, only 2 are currently being enacted, and those are the information sharing between government agencies. You see a pattern developing here. Where the Privacy Act started from was data matching with Inland Revenue. We've gone to reform, and one of the principal amendments that the government has grabbed onto is the need to have greater information sharing across particularly social agencies to meet government objectives. Well, that's how we're told. And another minor amendment to one of the information privacy principles. But in general, the Law Commission has said the privacy principles are working okay and they're not going to do anything to them. There's other laws also which affect privacy on our statute books. You would have heard a lot about the teapot tapes last year and covert interception of private communications. That's actually dealt with in the Crimes Act and has some pretty significant sanctions. So if we're talking about chilling effects, certainly the prospect of a journalist being prosecuted for a criminal offence under the Crimes Act may well have some, give them some pause next time they're invited to cover a public event in a public place between 2 highly public individuals. Anyway, if you're interested in health privacy, there's a whole section of the Health Act which expressly deals with that, and often these bits and pieces are overlooked. And of course we still have the common law continuing to develop. So we have a pathway from a case called Tucker, which dealt with a concept quickly becoming outmoded, a concept of practical obscurity, which I can talk about if anybody wants to. Practical obscurity meaning that over time privacy can grow back even over public events. Tucker was a person in need of a heart transplant at a time when you couldn't get them in New Zealand. He had a public fundraising campaign to get him to Australia to have a heart transplant, and the Truth newspaper was about to report that he was also a convicted pedophile. And Tucker went to the court and sought an injunction, and that was the first recognition of a tort of privacy in New Zealand. And of course, since then, which was in the early 1980s, we've had the Court of Appeal consider the issue, thanks to Mike Hoskins and paparazzi taking photographs of his children. So you can sue where there is a disclosure of private facts. So here we do have a qualitative element being brought in, which would be offensive to right-thinking members of the public. It's quite a high threshold. So there's always something happening in privacy law. Facebook's unilaterally changing their terms and conditions, or the government wants to do more. We've got new search and surveillance. We've got an electronic identity verification bill to verify ourselves online. We've got drug testing of beneficiaries, and ACC's having to put itself back together after a privacy meltdown. Elsewhere in the world, people are often declaring the death of privacy. It's not going to happen. It hasn't happened. The first time I read a story declaring the death of privacy, I think was a cover story on The Economist about 1995. That, incidentally, was a time when I probably could have named most of the people practicing privacy law in the world. These days, I belong to mailing lists of privacy professionals that number in 10,000s of membership. So privacy is not dead, even though we continue to see these almost weekly reports of its demise. On the other hand, we see emerging calls for greater increases in privacy protection, particularly out of Europe, and a greater discussion of concepts such as a right to be forgotten. On one side of the Atlantic, those discussions are greeted with cries of it's the end of freedom of expression, and on the other side we see a more measured discussion saying that's hyperbole that's unsupported by what's actually being proposed here. People are arguing really for a right to have effective deletion from indexing systems. I actually went to a lecture by a great jurist Michael Kirby back in the 1990s. He was one of the people who actually sat on the OECD committee in 1980, and he revisited privacy in the mid-90s and argued for a right not to be indexed back when Google was in its infancy. I haven't heard any more talk of that since, but we still see this interesting struggle. We've just recently seen a Declaration of Internet Rights, and it has as Article 1, the right of freedom of expression, and I think as number 5, protection of privacy. And how we reconcile those and how that discussion takes place is going to be really interesting and quite sort of vital, I think. Anyway, pause. Over to you. And if I have heard that lame joke about, I'm going to ask you, but it would be a breach of privacy, once I've heard it a million times. So poor old Marie, you can understand her chagrin and good humour as she shrugged that off this morning.
So I've often wondered with the whole teapot thing, having gone through ethics committees to get psych research approvals many times over during my academic career, we used a test called for collecting data in public, which was whether or not there was any expectation of privacy in a public space. We were allowed to collect conversations in, say, Altair Square, as long as it was anonymised and reported in an anonymous form. So going back to the teapot incident, I would have considered two politicians who invited media to a cafe to not have any expectation of privacy, regardless of whether or not they said, okay, the closed media session or the open media session is now over, just because of the setting they were in. Now, it's interesting you said that that's a Crimes Act thing. What is your take in terms of the New Zealand law that should have been applied to that?
Look, that was another, what do they call it? Cluster truck, I think, of conflicting values, mindful of the fact that we are live streaming. You did have publicity hogs in a public place. I cannot conceive of that being private. But then, if you set aside your politics and you think of yourself in a cafe, which is a private place in some senses, you have a license to enter, you want to have a huddle with your girlfriend and talk about why it is that she is going to leave you, despite your entreaties, and just what a bad person you really are. What would you think of finding a microphone in the flower pot or in the salt shaker? So, these privacy is, if nothing else, completely contextual and largely subjective. I'm a little bit cynical about the umbrage the Prime Minister took in that place, but I'd be interested in taking a vote. I don't pour scorn on people who stand up for the Prime Minister's right to make a complaint. Can I just ask for an indication? Who thought that the collection and threatened broadcast of that discussion was legitimate? Yes, was legitimate. Sorry, who thought that the cameraman's actions, the collection of that conversation and threatened broadcast of it was legitimate? Okay, thank you. Who thought the Prime Minister's privacy was breached? So, in this microcosm of the wider community, we have a pretty significant majority of public opinion expressing, what the collective values are. It's not 100%, but it's a pretty significant proportion calling BS on the PM. Any other questions or topics for our last couple of minutes? Yes.
I'd like to ask about the convergence between privacy and copyright, and that if I take a photo of you in a compromising position or whatever, I hold the copyright to that image, and I think it's an image of you, it's identifiable information about you, and there's a really interesting area in there. Actually, I don't really know how to frame it up as
I
a question.
understand what you're saying. Now, there is a really strange provision of the Copyright Act. When was it reviewed, Scott? What year is the Copyright Act? 94, yeah. They didn't talk to anyone about privacy, but they put this privacy, it's got a subheading of privacy protection in it. And in the situation you describe, it is the person who commissions the photograph, not the subject of the photograph, who has the privacy right, if any, in that image. Having said that, there was an interesting case applying the tort of privacy in the South Island, where a farmer engaged the services of a sex worker and then used photographs of that session, which she had consented to, in an advertisement that he placed in a local mag to solicit swinging couples. This is tawdry Timaru for you. Now, I tell you, privacy law does make for the most interesting case law. So in that case, the sex worker sued not for a breach of copyright for the use of that photograph, but for a breach of privacy. She was identifiable in that photograph. That photograph constituted personal information about her. She argued there was no legitimate right to use that information. So you're right, I mean, well, actually, copyright is not a proxy for privacy protection, and it is not an effective mechanism for privacy protection. Privacy is something else. Copyright is a commercial right to exploit and gain reward from. Privacy is something that is more about the inherent dignity of humanity. But thanks, that's a really interesting point. Donald.
Yeah, thanks. It's a real shame your talk wasn't sort of part of a keynote, because I think it would have informed a lot of what's been spoken about around this conference. I guess I'm interested to know what your thoughts are when you hear the comment that, I guess, you know, younger people than me that are called digital natives don't care about privacy.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and it's crap. I mean, it is. I follow people on Twitter and on Facebook who you know, seemingly put a heck of a lot out there. But, you know, you only see what you see. You don't see what they're withholding. And there are very deliberate decisions being made there about what people share, in what circumstances, and what they make up, and what they do pseudonymously. And I think that there are differing concepts of privacy intergenerationally, just as there are differing abilities to use the technology. I mean, Grandma doesn't have a Twitter account. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point, and I do think there's an awful lot of condescension to the young, and a lot of old people talking about privacy in a sort of first do no harm way, a precautionary principle to technology because of what the poor innocents, you know, what will happen to the poor innocents. The poor innocents know as soon as this stuff is released and they can make their decisions, is my view. Sometimes they make silly decisions. I have one more question here waiting. I've got 2 minutes to go. Thank you.
I'll put myself in the camp just before, you know, one who's a younger person who doesn't really care about privacy, or at least I think privacy is a certain extent an illusion, and it's going to be passing away. It's just something we've created recently. Like if you go back far in time, people just lived in a small village. You knew everything that was going on. There was no real privacy. People would, you know, sleep in a one-bedroom house, you know, with, you know, 3 generations there. You know, there was no privacy in those small villages. Then we had the Industrial Revolution come about. People flocked to cities, so there was large populations there. People started to have privacy because you could be 1 in a million people in the city. But now technology has step ahead. We've got this internet, all connected, and thus privacy is starting to drift away again. Well, it was just a very fleeting incident we've had.
I mean, thanks for your contribution. It's an interesting narrative. It's an interesting story that you tell. I don't necessarily agree with it all. And for someone who says, I don't care about privacy, I say, how's your mother's mental illness? What was the sex like last time you had it, and who was it with? You know, there's a whole bunch of questions that I don't want an answer, please. I really don't. But sorry, I think there was somebody else. We only have a couple of seconds. Yeah.
So notwithstanding what you were saying, I think one of the reasons that there's a bit of misunderstanding about young people's attitudes to privacy is because there's a confusion to some extent, or there's been a shift away from thinking about privacy in terms of the types of information people are willing to give toward a much stronger emphasis on the degree of control and autonomy that people exercise over which types of information they actually publish.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I really want to have a shout out to the work of NetSafe. And I think rather than regulate in this area before we know what the harms are, we should educate to keep people safe and make sure people are aware of the tools that are available to keep them out of trouble. Thank you so much.